civilians in Gaza. So it was really quite chilling. So this was let's see. I want to make sure I haven't lost my place here. Yes, this was South Africa's oral argument, and they ended it by asking for 9 provisional measures for the court to put in place in order to essentially prevent any possibility of genocide while the court would review the case to determine whether or not genocide was in fact taking place. The very first of these 9 recommendations was that Israel must suspend all military action in and against Gaza. And that turns out to be kind of an important request on the part of South Africa when trying to determine whether or not the court has ruled for or against a ceasefire. Israel's response to this was to begin by saying that there was in fact no reason to think, or that South Africa had not demonstrated that there was in fact a dispute between Israel and South Africa. And the reason they said this was because South Africa did not afford Israel the opportunity to have direct discussions about the matter. So it was a kind of way of saying, look, you should have talked to us first before you went to the court. And so until you do, the court should not be hearing this case. It was very, very kind of lawyerly move. And I will as kind of jump forward. The court didn't buy that at all, of course. Israel then denied that there was any intention to commit genocide. They were claiming that the remarks that were made by Netanyahu and others were just kind of glib, offhanded things, and that the true policy of the state of Israel should be seen in more formal presentations about what the goals of their war is. And so they were just kind of like brushing these comments off by saying that these were kind of political expressions in the heat of the moment when everybody was very, very distressed, and you shouldn't take them seriously. So there is no real intent going on here. What I think was where they were really trying to divert the conversation away from genocide was to say that genocide, since there was no intent, there is no genocide going on there, and that what really should be examined here is whether or not the parties to the dispute are abiding by international humanitarian law. So they wanted the court and everybody to be looking at the Geneva Conventions and not the Genocide Convention. And when you think about that, there are 2 large questions that come into play when you think about the rules of war, the laws of war. One is what's called jus ad bellum, and the other is jus in bellum, and that is asking the question: when is it proper? When is it okay for a country to use armed force against another country? When is it okay to go to war? That's jus ad bellum, and then jus in bellum is what is it okay for a country to do when they're engaged in a war? Obviously, there's some rules here about what you can and cannot do. And so those are 2 kind of broad ways of thinking about what Israel wanted people to be thinking about. And Israel believed that their war is being conducted in a way that can be justified under this criterion. And they made that case. I won't go into the details of that case, but I do want to talk about both of these categories, going to war and what you can do in the war. As far as justifying going to war, Israel's case rests on the UN Charter, Article 51, which gives the right of all states to defend themselves. So this is the notion that there is a right to self-defense. But we really want to look at what is self-defense here? What does it mean? What can one do when one is defending oneself? And there are 3 main ideas, 3 main theories, you might say. about what self-defense permits. The first of one is called halting and the halting and repelling theory. And what that means is that a victim state, a state that has been attacked, has the right under self-defense to halt the attack and repel the attack. Now, if that is all that is involved in self-defense, then once Israel had driven the Hamas fighters back into Gaza, any further action would go above and beyond self-defense. They have defended themselves by halting and repelling the attack. Just about every international lawyer in the world agrees that this is certainly a core feature of the right to self-defense. You must be allowed to halt an attack and repel it. But there are other theories that allow a victim country to be able to go further than just halting and repelling. And one of them is kind of roughly known as the trigger theory of self-defense. And what that essentially says is that if a country is attacked, they are then illegally attacked. They then have the right to respond until their military objectives are completed, until their military objectives are met. It essentially says you can just really go in once you're attacked. The attacking country essentially can have very little to no rights at all against any kind of response. It is a very, very extreme view about what amounts to self-defense. That theory has versions, though, you might say, and one of the versions moderates this rather extreme view, and that's a version that says the attack on the victim country must reach a certain threshold. It can't be just, a small little incursion across the border or something like that. It has to be a real significant attack before the country can really appropriately respond in self-defense. And the self-defense, the action in response, must be immediate. It must be, or at least very, very close to the initial attack. You can't wait, a year or so after the attack is over and then respond in self-defense. It has to be immediate, and it has to be proportionate. It has to kind of match the incursion, the attack that was done against that particular state. And then finally, it has to be necessary. There can't be any other way in which you can defend yourself against the attacking country. Without it has to be. You have to be necessary to go beyond just the halting and repelling. So that's the trigger theory. And then there's a third theory which allows a country to defend itself from future attacks, a future attack theory. And that essentially means that if there is a country that is fearing an immediate attack, an imminent attack from another country, it is okay for them to do a preemptive strike. It is okay to go after that country to prevent the attack on what would be expected to be the victim country. And then there's also another version of this future attack theory, which goes even further, which says a country that is in some way in an ongoing conflict, off and on ongoing conflict with another country, has the right, has a self-defense right to make an attack that will degrade the enemy's military capacity. So essentially, you've got this kind of like Cold War going on, long war going on, and in order to defend oneself, that breaks out into hot wars every now and then, a country has the right under this theory to attack the enemy country to just simply to degrade their military capacity. Now, when you look at what Israel has been doing, what they are doing is they are relying on the most extreme examples of what would count as self-defense. You think about self-defense as being this from the most moderate of ideas about using violence. You've got the halt and repel all the way over to this trigger theory in which a country can just do whatever they can once they have been attacked in any way. So you've got this spectrum of what justifies attack under self-defense, and Israel is adopting almost uniformly the most permissive ideas about what will count as self-defense in their attack and their war in and against Gaza. Going on to what's proper in the course of the war, this is also covered under international humanitarian law. There are two important principles that I think really one needs to look at. One is the principle of discrimination. And what that says is that in the course of a war, assuming the war is just, assuming it's okay to go in there and attack the opponent, you must discriminate between civilians and combatants. You can't have just indiscriminate bombing. I mean, and of course that's been talked about a lot in the course of this in the war in Gaza, indiscriminate bombing. Israel is of course claiming that they take all efforts whatsoever to try to distinguish, and they're only bombing Hamas targets, et cetera, et cetera. I think some of the facts on the ground just belie that, of course. But that's the argument that they're making, that they are in fact discriminating in their attack. The other principle is proportionality. And we often think about proportionality as, you know, how many people are killed on one side versus how many people are killed on the other side, is what's the proportion. And that's not really it. The comparison is between the military aim of the attacking of the country versus the amount of collateral damage that military aim produces. So a very significant military goal will allow for greater collateral damage. A trivial military goal must have only trivial collateral damage. But inside human rights law, it is quite permissible that collateral damage will take place, and it just must be proportional to the military advantage. And of course, Israel is claiming that what they're doing is proportional, that all of this death and destruction is justified by the goal of defeating this terrorist organization, Hamas. So let me switch over here to my next bit here. The International Court of Justice's decision. What is it that they came out with? As I think I mentioned to you, the court said, look, yeah, South Africa has standing. Come on, let's be real. There is a dispute between Israel and South Africa, so this is a real thing, and they have a right to be here in the court. And they argued that South Africa's case about whether a genocide is taking place or not was plausible. Now, when you think about the word plausible, I think, at least my intuitions about the word plausible, is that it's something more than merely possible. It's not possible, it's merely possible, and maybe it's short of likely, but it is something to be taken very, very seriously. So that was a real, that was a shock to a lot of people, that the court would come out and say that South Africa's case was plausible. And I think that's because a number of people, I think, are a little bit cynical about how the International Court of Justice would weigh into something as as grievous as genocide. But they did say that it was plausible. And furthermore, they said the danger to Palestinians is urgent and the potential harms are potentially irremediable. And so that would justify issuing provisional measures in order to restrain Israel from some of the actions that they are doing. They were essentially saying, yeah, the provisional measures that South Africa is asking for are things that we should take seriously here. They said we do not have to look at South Africa's, and we do not have to adopt exactly South Africa's recommendations on what these measures should be. We can write our own, and that's essentially what they wound up doing. And South Africa had asked for 9 different provisional measures, and the court has issued 6 provisional orders. And I'll pull that up and we'll look at that in just a bit of what those orders were and how they compare to what South Africa had asked for. But shortly after the media, shortly after the ruling came down, almost uniformly, every report that I heard or read or saw, the analysts were saying, number one, the court stopped short of calling for a ceasefire. That seemed to be the premise to everything that happened. The court has not asked for a ceasefire. All they have asked for is that Israel take greater care in not killing civilians. Now, keep in mind, the court did not accept the idea that international humanitarian law should be the framework. The court stuck with the fact that South Africa was issuing this under the convention, under the Genocide Convention. So the whole idea about civilian casualties versus combatant casualties is really irrelevant in the Genocide Convention. The Genocide Convention doesn't say anything at all about civilian, it doesn't make the distinction between civilian casualties and combatant casualties. It says that if a country is found to be committing genocide, they have to stop killing those people. Whether there's in times of war or in times of peace, they have to stop the genocide. And so that was something that really struck me, is that the media kind of fell over itself to be able to wind up saying that this stopped short of genocide. Well, let's compare some of the provisions. I'm going to pull up this and share this screen. Okay. Number one, the top line there, the provisional measure requested by South Africa, which was not adopted by the International Court of Justice. They asked that the state of Israel shall immediately suspend its military operations in and against Gaza. Okay, just stop your military operations. That's something that they should do. That was not that wording, I should say, was not accepted by the criminal court. They didn't include that in their six measures that they were asking for. They did, however, I think I may need to scroll down here a little bit to get everything. Yes. What they did is they reproduced, and this is actually the reproduced language from South Africa's request. Their fourth request is what it was, South Africa's fourth request. But this is in the ICJ's provisional, and that is, and I highlight this, that the state of Israel shall, in relation to the Palestinians in Gaza, not the civilian Palestinians, the Palestinians in Gaza, prevent the commission of all acts within the scope of Article 2 of this, that is the Genocide Convention. In particular, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, and imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. There's actually in the Genocide Convention a clause E, which prohibits transferring children from their families, essentially, to elsewhere. That was not included in either South Africa's request or in the ICJ order, because I think it just isn't relevant to what's happening in Gaza right now. But these four things do seem to be quite relevant. And the ICJ said, look, you've got to stop doing this. Pardon me. Furthermore, the ICJ also said that the state of Israel shall ensure with immediate effect, that its military does not commit any of the acts described in point 1 above. So not only must Israel not do these things, but it must tell its military to stop doing these things. Its military they must ensure that the military does not do these sorts of things. Now, the question that is posed here is this a demand for a ceasefire? This is kind of a little homey analogy here. A parent might tell their child, clean up your room. Okay, that's one way. That's one thing they could say. They could also say, make your bed, hang up your clothes, and put your toys away. That's the same thing as saying clean up your room. In one case, what we have here is suspending its military operations in and against Gaza. That's like saying clean up your room. And here it's itemizing all the things that need to be done in order to avoid the genocide. Okay, so my sense is that, yeah, it might have been nice if the ICJ had accepted South Africa's first recommendation, but they have in fact called for, at least in effect, called for a ceasefire based upon the measures that they did in fact order. This is something that I hear sporadically. This point has been made sporadically in all the newscasts that I have listened to. Every now and then someone comes on and says, yes, they did call for a ceasefire in effect. Just recently, I was very happy to read that the U.S. Special Rapporteur for the Occupied Territories for the UN agrees with my reading of this, that this is a call for a ceasefire without ever using the word ceasefire, but this is a call for a ceasefire. So that's kind of the argument that has gone forward here. I want to make one comment, however, about how Israel and other apologists for Israel have tried to escape the idea that this counts as calling for a ceasefire. And they focus on these words here, all acts within the scope of Article 2 of this, you get it, okay. Acts within the scope of Article 2 of this genocide convention. What they're claiming is that this verbiage says that an act within the scope of the Genocide Convention is an act that is done with the intention of killing in whole or in part a people. And so what they're wanting to do is they want to fold the idea of the intention of an act into the act. To my mind, having taken plenty of having done plenty of study in the philosophy of language, the idea that somehow an intention somehow is an essential element of an action is kind of puzzling. It's a weird position to hold. But this is the way in which I think Israel and its apologists are attempting to avoid the idea that what is being called for is that Israel should stop killing, wounding, and terrorizing people in Gaza. That's kind of it. I don't know, what did I hit about half an hour or so? That's what I had to say for you. So I'd be happy to entertain any questions or hear your responses to this. I know a lot of you are well up on all of what's going on here, and I'd love to hear what you're thinking about what's happening.
Well, let me jump in before we open it. Generally, I believe they were looking at official statements, not statements they said somebody on the street corner was calling for some horrific action to happen, but they did record all official governmental directives and statements. And right early on, to have the prime minister say, oh, we're going to cut off all the water, food, medicine, power, whatever other items he added to that list. To me, that struck me as an intent to genocide. I mean, how even your own hostages need those things, you know. And you didn't cover the fact of how about recovering hostages, hostage taking, and what have you, because that is kind of the item that may well cause Netanyahu and his crowd to have to change course. Because how do you expect to recover people when you're saying you're going to starve them to death and deny them water and medicine, and then bombing places that logically they would be held? So I'm just curious if you had anything to add to that. Like that was right out of the box. He said,
Yeah, I think those are the kinds of comments that South Africa had pointed to, saying, look, they're talking genocide here, and there's no real black and white about it. And Israel has kind of backtracked on that and say, no, those aren't really what's going on. And they're claiming that they are allowing food and medicine, et cetera, in. It's a trickle, but they're allowing it in, and this is necessary in order to achieve their military aims. So Israel is making this case, and to you or me and many people, it's a very, very flimsy, almost ridiculous case. But they are making this case, and they will do this if this question about genocide is embedded inside international humanitarian law, where these kinds of questions become relevant. With regard to how this is going to this is going to affect the hostages that are there. That's a political military question. I just kind of wanted to stick with what was going on in the ICJ. So I really don't have any really important, valuable things to say about that.
okay, Teresa, you got your hand up.
I do. Thank you, Alan. That was very clear and delineated. I want to go back to one of the things that you had mentioned at this that has popped up for me sometimes when I read articles, etc. And you were talking about the soldiers who were like dancing around and it seemed to me that was very similar to some of the things that had gone on in my area of the world, which is Latin America in the past, where like they would call it the bad apples of the military, etc. And that seemed to me in some of the things that I read that was what some of the Israeli power structure, the state structure, was sort of calling it, oh, the bad apples, things that were happening to the bad apples. But I also know that in other some of the things have been adjudicated in other areas of the world, is that the concept, very firm idea of command authority, that things don't happen unless the higher up and the commanders were saying things. And I don't know, and that's a clear concept that the US military accepts in other places, but I don't know how that idea of command authority and therefore state responsibility for some of the quote unquote bad apples is fitting into the International Court of Justice, where does that fit into both the laws of genocide and the other one was the humanitarian, the points along humanitarian. If I don't make myself clear.
No, I think you're quite clear, and I think the court. I don't know that the court. I'd have to review the ruling again about that relationship between those individual soldiers, say for example, and the Israeli authorities in the cabinet. What the relationship winds up being, but certainly in the South Africa case, the argument was made, as you kind of implied, was that there was enough that was being said by the military, by the department, by generals, and by the Minister of Defense and Netanyahu himself, that that made it obvious to the soldiers that their role was to go in and kill everybody that they could find. At least some of the soldiers were seeing it that way. I don't want to suggest that every soldier was seeing that, but I think there was enough of that indication from the command that the evidence of these soldiers dancing around shows how effective the call for genocide had become. That's really what I think South Africa was doing by showing that particular footage. And I'd say, by the way, early in my youth, I was very active in solidarity groups, peace and justice solidarity groups, with regard to Central America in particular. And that was really kind of one of the reasons why I became initially interested in Israel. Because Israel I found at that time, Israel was very important in providing various arms and technology and assistance, training, et cetera, to
It
many
is.
of the death squads in Central America. And so I
In
thought,
the
okay,
past,
well, we can, and
yes,
yes. So,
you are
yeah,
correct on that, past and present.
yeah.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Oh, anyone else care to raise their hand? Wow. Did a
You're all
hell of a job.
speechless. Come on.
You said all that has to be said.
Well, presuming everybody knows how to do the hand raising thing, we'll go over that real quick. Well, okay, at least two of us are. So let's start with Lynn.
Yes, I stepped away for a minute, so don't know if you address this. Can you tell us about the citizens, Israeli citizens in West Bank, and how they've been indoctrinated to, I guess, take the farmers' land away from them and actually kill them? Can you address that? What's happening?
Yeah, I think all of you probably have heard this almost as well as me, or probably as well as me, is that the media inside Israel is just really doing a very, very poor job of describing exactly what is happening to Palestinians. It's a remarkably tightly controlled media. In fact, there's a law in Israel that says no one can report on international affairs, and I presume that any affairs with Palestinians in the West Bank would be considered international affairs. Any report through any media has to first be approved by the Ministry of Defense. So there's a body inside the Ministry of Defense, essentially a censor that says, you can say this, you can report on this, you can't report on that. And so there's a really tight control over what it is that the people of Israel are hearing and seeing about this. I have to say, looking at the history, from the very start, the leadership of Israel understood, believed, and I think perhaps understood that their survival as a state, rightly or wrongly, their survival as a state required that they have a strong security, strong defense mechanisms, and that over the years, this has just become a kind of part of Israel's DNA, is that security is absolutely vital. They have a huge part of their budget goes towards security. Because this is the kind of in their DNA, they take these very extreme views about things like their self-defense. Other countries are kind of a little bit more understanding that, you've got to behave yourself a little bit, even when you're attacked. And Israel doesn't seem to be in that position. So that creates, I think, a sentiment among Israelis that they are under threat. They understand themselves to be in danger all the time from their Palestinian neighbors, and they are reacting in ways which unfortunately are just absolutely detrimental to everyone in the region, everyone in the world, really.
Joan, what have you got for us?
Yeah,
Unmute.
that was very, very helpful in terms of how bad the situation is in terms of the many of the people in Israel. But of course, there are people in Israel who are objecting to what is happening, even though their information sources are limited, as you were just explaining. The question that I had was, what I thought I was keeping up with all this, but what is the timing in terms of when the ICJ, statement, whatever, the second one, it's come out, I believe, or were you describing the first one? And if it was the second one that you were describing, what is the timing, and what, if any, responses have there been from either Israel or the people in the Palestinians?
I think what you're asking about, there are two things with regard to Israel that are going on right now. One is this South Africa case about genocide, and that's what I was talking about.
Right.
And the next step on that is that I think by Monday, there was some report that they had to do it by Friday, but by Monday, Israel had to submit a report on what they have done in order to abide by the provisional measures that the court has ordered. I'm skeptical that Israel is going to provide that report. Maybe they will, but I'm kind of skeptical that they will. We'll see how that goes. That's really the next step with regard to the genocide case. But the other case that I think you're thinking about is the General Assembly back in 2022, I think, passed a resolution asking for the International Court of Justice, the International Court of Justice, to make a ruling on the legal implications of the occupation of Israel's occupation. And over the past week, we've had six sessions in which various countries have weighed in on the legality of Israel's occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. There were some the arguments that were being made. Let me share the screen again. I think I've got it available. Oh boy. I think it'll take me a moment to navigate to this, I think.
Take your time.
Oh.
Alan, your screen is more cleaner than mine.
I don't think, maybe I have it, it might be here. No, it's not. Maybe I can do this from memory. What the Palestinians have argued, and this is with regard to the occupation, is that three things, hope I can remember all three of them, three things that Israel has done are not permissible, not legal. Stop sharing, come on.
There you go. I was gonna say
Three things they've done are not permissible. One is that they have invaded by force territory that is not theirs. Number three is that they are violating the rights of the Palestinians. Oh yes, and number two is annexing. Okay, so they've invaded a country, and that's illegal. They are effectively annexing that country, and they've annexed some of it, and that is illegal. And they are denying the citizens in that area of equal rights, and therefore they are setting up an apartheid regime. Okay, so that's what Palestine has argued. Israel did not participate in this, but the United States did speak on this. And what they essentially argued was that the court should not weigh in on the legality of the occupation, because instead it should follow the framework that has been set up by UN Resolution 242 and 338. 242 essentially established the green line and essentially said any resolution of this conflict between Palestinians and Israel needs to be negotiated. And 338 essentially called for a ceasefire in the 1973 war, and have the parties come back to the negotiating table. And so what the United States was saying was that you shouldn't worry about whether occupation is legal or not. What you should do is allow the negotiation that is taking place between Palestinians and Israelis to run its course. That's the proper way of going about this. And to my mind, that's just kind of nutty. It's like if one of the parties to the negotiation is in violation of the law, allowing them to, like participate in some negotiation just seems to me completely off base. And I think it will be really telling if the ICJ does come out and say, look, this occupation is in fact illegal. They've said it before. I mean, the UN has said it before, and the ICJ would just simply be confirming this fact. So I think it probably will wind up happening. When that happens, I don't know. I don't know when they're set to do that.
Before we go to Analoy, we do have a link to the hearing, which Alan, you sent us last week. I think I even put it on a blast, so people can see, what the hearing consists of. Does that make sense to put it in the chat? What do you think?
Sounds good to me.
All right. Okay, let's go on to Analoy.
Okay. Well, first of all, Alan, thank you very much for your presentation. I really appreciated the clarity and conciseness of the information that you presented. So thank you. And I have maybe more of a comment than a real question, is that I saw one of those little banner headlines that you get with your internet provider that said, was talking about Netanyahu's plans for after the war for rebuilding. And I clicked on it and I thought I was going to see something. And what I saw was a statement about he was planning to aggressively push for new settlements in that whole area. And I don't know why I was surprised or stunned, but I just thought this not good.
Well, I agree, and I think that's where they're going with this. And I think one of the things to put what's happening now in perspective is that the number of killed and wounded in this particular phase of the conflict between Arabs and Jews, Israelis and Palestinians, is roughly equal to all the Arab casualties in all of the wars up to now. Essentially, this is unprecedented. The Nakba, which was a horrible thing, drove about 700 to 750,000 people into refugee status, displaced person status, and it killed probably about 15,000 people. And that's held up as being the catastrophe. Well, what we're looking at right now is double that. And so the idea that somehow, and Netanyahu has made no bones about the fact that he has been wanting to assimilate, essentially in the end annex, all of historic Palestine from the river to the sea, including Gaza. It seems like this is a case in which what he is doing is making life unlivable in the Gaza Strip, so that essentially digesting it into the state of Israel will be much easier to do. So I think that's really where they're going, where they're going with this.
Okay, you satisfied with that, Analo?
Yes.
Okie dokie. Teresa.
That work? Okay. So another thought that kept occurring to me was like I keep hearing in my head the old and I think it's attributed to Stalin, the like comeback that he had to somebody about and how many divisions does the Pope have? Like how are you going to enforce it? Like the Pope does have some Swiss guards and fancy outfits, but like the Pope, that's but the UN has UN peacekeeping forces, but but so what? So my question is sort of how many divisions? How does an enforcement? How many divisions does the Pope have? Where's the enforcement besides moral authority, which does not seem to very much weight with Bibi Netanyahu.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And when you think about it, our Supreme Court does not have enforcement authority either. Okay, so it makes these rulings, and it depends upon the executive branch and other branches of government, large and small, to abide by its rulings and to enforce those rulings. In the United Nations, the ICJ does not have enforcement authority, but the Security Council does. And so ultimately, the Security Council would be the body which would wind up enforcing whatever the ICJ calls upon Israel to do. Of course, the United States has been vetoing resolution after resolution. It stands in the way of enforcing anything that might be helpful in this regard. Having said that, I don't want to just throw up my hands and say this ICJ ruling is something we don't want to even think about because there's no enforcement, because it's meaningful in how people think about the whole situation. It's meaningful about how people think about Israel and the Palestinians and the United States and the UK. How it is that we wind up behaving changes international relations. And that's meaningful. That's very meaningful. Now, it's incremental. It's not going to be boots on the ground, you might say, to enforce these sorts of things, but I think it will change things rather significantly. It's also important to recognize that the Genocide Convention, Article 3 of the Genocide Convention, makes states that are supportive of genocide complicit. And that is a crime. So right now, the United States could easily be charged in the ICJ with being complicit with genocide if genocide turns out to be what is ruled. And Article 4 of the Genocide Treaty says anyone, whether they're leaders of a state or individuals, if they are complicit in genocide, they can be punished. And that, I presume, would go to the International Criminal Court to make our judgment about who should and should not be punished for genocide. So the United States and the UK and many other countries are on the hook here for being held accountable for this in one way or another. Not through the Security Council, of course, but through their international reputation and how they're going to be able to work in the world is on the hook here. That's why I think
congressional apportionment of the funds to send the arms is evidence of complicity.
Exactly. What I think we need to be thinking about here is exactly how to support and boost the idea that the United States and other countries need to begin abiding by international law, changing things in a way where they will respect these things. And that's where we were seeing an upswell of people that are saying, look, we don't want to see the money being continually going to Israel, as court rulings come down and say, look, that's genocide. That's genocide you're supporting. The case inside Congress is going to be a whole lot stronger for saying, no, we really don't want to be on the side of genocide.
Yeah, but about all of that takes time. I think a lot of people are wringing their hair and pulling out their hair, I should say. Anyway, no comment on that. Yeah, we'll skip over that part. But it just strikes me as that there's so much evidence and historical evidence, like how they behaved in the West Bank and the Green Line. Like, how did that come about? That what you've got is the serpentine concrete thing under the Bush administration that they wanted to call it a separation barrier and whatever. But I mean, it's just that so much evidence, just preponderance of evidence that they're basically living in violation of everything from the 242, which I believe was stating that they would refrain from or withdraw from territory occupied during the conflict, the 67 conflict. I think that was what generated that thing. And they never have. I mean, if you're
Right.
in complete control of the population, of the exits, the entrances, and they show even the water rationing, like the settlements, which obviously illegal, and no one's had the gumption to really put their foot down on that.
Yeah.
And they get, it's all in written. Yeah, the allotment of water to settlements is like 3 times what's allotted to the native villagers that have been there for hundreds of years. I mean, it goes on and on and on and on here. So
You
it's
know,
just,
Mike,
Yeah,
you made a point about this ruling, or the wall that has been constructed in the West Bank, and there was a ruling by it's a advisory opinion by the International Court of Justice in 2004, I believe it was. The General Assembly asked the court to rule on whether or not the wall that Israel was building at the time was in violation of international law. And it was essentially a wall that would separate Jewish settlers, Israeli settlers, from the Palestinians living in the West Bank. And the court ruled that this was a violation of the Palestinians' right to move freely on the West Bank, that was a violation of their rights. And Israel argued that the wall was necessary as a matter of defense. It was again, self-defense, that they were putting up this wall against attacks that were coming from Palestinians against them. So it was a self-defense argument. And on that point, the International Court of Justice ruled that attacks from an occupied territory against the occupiers make self-defense arguments irrelevant. That they were just simply irrelevant. If you're an army and you're occupying someone else's land, you got to expect attacks. And you can't say this is self-defense when you do things like build walls and deny them rights and things like that. That was mentioned briefly in South Africa's case, if I recall, and it shows up every now and then. It is, I will say, a fairly controversial view, but it is nonetheless the view of the court. And so that kind of underlines the notion that somehow when they get around to ruling on whether or not the occupation is legal or not, they're certainly not going to say, well, it's okay because they're being attacked.
okay. If the other questions on this issue, I was kind of curious about that 191-page study you put together about this particular period from, you said the 1800s to the assassination of Rabin, I believe it was.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Anyway, well, let Ron go, but I'm just curious if you could perhaps comment on your take on that, because looks like we're getting short of questions to be asked. So I'm really curious what you came up with, but go ahead, Ron.
Alan, I'm wondering if you could address the whole human shield argument that Israel puts forth and Jewish friends of mine also put forth.
Yeah. That's essentially the argument that they are making in order to blunt the notion of collateral damage, that they're being indiscriminate, that they're essentially needing to do this in order to achieve their war aims. Now, achieving their war aims and balancing that against civilian damage is the proportional question. And one of the things that international lawyers have kind of come to an agreement on is that when you are balancing a war aim against civilian harm, you can't go to kind of like this absolute global level saying, we're doing this because winning the war is important. That's our military aim, is to win the war. What they have to do is look in granular detail about particular actions. So is this particular bomb strike going to have the military give us the military advantage that justifies the 20 people that are going to be killed there. And so Israel, in order to really use this to blunt the proportionality argument, they need to get into finer detail on that. I will say that you know, the idea that Hamas is putting their command centers and the like in tunnels underneath hospitals, et cetera, inside residential areas and the like, one should keep in mind that Israel's Defense Department has three main branches. One of them is located in kind of downtown Haifa, one's in Jerusalem, one's in Beersheba. So their military command centers are smack dab in the middle of an urban area full of civilians. So yeah, where are the Gazans going to put their resistance, but among the people who live there. There's no other place to go, essentially. In fact, I mean, one might argue that they've tried to avoid being next to civilians by digging underground where, you know, the civilians are. So one could make these arguments, but I have to say that it's just the whole human shield thing. It's also the examples of human shields in international law usually involve the actual transportation of civilians to military sites. That's that's the classic human shield thing, and not just, you know, our facility is near this place or near that place.
I'll call on myself.
Mike called on me, I'll call on Mike.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm just looking at the targeting of what was been destroyed. The targeting of water infrastructure, sewer infrastructure. I mean, these are hardly something that would have to be or should be destroyed if you're basically looking to get your hostages back or degrade the Hamas military infrastructure. I mean, again, it's just so much evidence of what they're going after. And the hospitals, like I spent 2 years in the military just before, I don't know how old I am, but it was a little before the Vietnam War really heated up. And I was in military police, of all things. And one of our classes was raised as to what is the status of hospitals, churches, things like that. And the term was only could be attacked if there was active fire coming from those locations or imminent, like somebody setting up a rocket launcher or an artillery piece on the roof of a hospital or a church, whatever. Other than that, there are no-go zones. They're not considered worthy military targets or legal military targets. And to have a tunnel under a hospital and alleged command center does not fit the bill. So on the face of it, on the laws of war, I was taught, was that you can't attack a hospital on the assumption that there may be somebody there. And then I think Kirby was even saying, oh, there was firing from the hospital. And he's the only one I ever heard even mention that. They have Doctors Without Borders, a lot of very, very respected medical organizations that have been from the beginning saying there's nothing going on in these hospitals except surgery and trying to keep people alive. And this whole idea of bombing people in the hospital environment, in the backyard, the front, they're seeking shelter. It just seemed like they're just gilding the lily and coming up with every wacky possible excuse, or we didn't do it. It must have been a rockets fired by Hamas. Yeah, on and on and on. There's such a body of evidence. There's so much eyewitness accounts, and you've seen it on the news. You see it everywhere. That I can't believe that the court has tied its hands by just following these little sort of nitpicking legalities when it seems like the laws of war and war crimes and general Geneva Convention violations are one after another, after another, after another. And even the logic of it is like they're saying, we want our hostages back. And I still can't figure out how you're supposed to get a hostage back when seems like you're doing everything possible to make sure they don't live. So it just, the whole thing is stunningly bizarre, and it seems to be so out of control. And I could see this, supposedly this poor guy burned himself up today. Well, the news will probably be on more of it tomorrow. But somehow he was a U.S. military person, I guess, attached to perhaps some of the reconnaissance or something, and knew what was happening in Gaza, and he just said that's it, and he lit himself up with holding I think a Palestinian flag, active duty Air Force guy supposedly, yelling "Free Palestine," and had recorded a statement saying that what's going on is unendurable. He's not going to stand for it, and that was his way of, kind of like the Buddhist monks in my era during the Vietnam War period, when they burnt themselves up in protest. And it's just very frustrating for people that even want the hostages released, and yet seems like procedures being followed are like dragging their feet, and there's so much evidence of illegality going on, and no one's a champion of Hamas. Absolutely no one. I mean, to me they're pretty much in the category of Smotrich and Ben Gvir, that they feel violence in the advancement of whatever scheme they have in their mind that God told them to do, what have you. Both of them seem to have the same. They're listening to the same porn. So I don't know. I'll just leave it at that. It's frustrating for everybody who wants to see an end to this to have to.
Yeah, why don't we see if
endure it.
Alan has a response?
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm frustrated about it all as well, but I want to cling on to like a tiniest slender of hope here. I think in the rather recently, and I think it was as the violence is continuing, even after the Court of Justice came out with this ruling, and with the testimony that's been taking place about the occupation. I think that the Biden administration is finally getting to a point where they don't want to give a complete blank check anymore. I think an official, maybe it was head of the CIA or something like that, met with the Ministry of Defense. They had a conversation, and the Israelis came out of it saying, we've made progress. I think what that means is, oh my gosh, the United States and Israel are actually negotiating what it is that should happen in the war. And Biden's remarks about, the killing is over the top and things like that tells me that the U.S., as much as a long leash as it's going to give Israel all the time, is at least putting Israel back on the leash, put it that way. And so I'm kind of hopeful that that's where things are going to turn. And I suspect it might have something to do with how close the vote in Michigan might turn out to be in November. Because if Biden loses Michigan in November, he virtually has to run the table on all the rest of the swing states in order to be reelected. So I think he's seeing that this is a problem for hanging on to the White House.
Yeah, I agree with you that the domestic issues of the young people who are kind of receding, and the progressives that are receding from Biden are part of his calculation.
Carol.
Oh, I also heard in the news tonight that protests against Netanyahu are increasing.
Yeah.
So they got to throw in that factor too.
Yeah, it just seems like no one's particularly happy with how things are working out in the Israeli side or the Palestinian side or any side. So it's just, hey, well, any other questions? We're coming close to the hour and a half, which is generally when we kind of turn the lights out.
I would only say that it's a good idea for any and all of us to continue to get in touch with the likes of Senate Representative Kevin Mullen or Anna Escher or whomever represents you. And I'll call on Joan in a minute, and tell them that you would like a ceasefire. And also, very important, we sent an alert out about this last week about you would want them to restore funding to the United Nations Relief Works Agency, because they are the ones who are really trying to get some help for the Palestinian civilians while this is going on, before this is going on, and after it's going on.
Yeah.
So, Joan?
Joan,
Yeah, this is maybe sort of a small thing, but should we include or ask Alan to include something about this business with Netanyahu, carrying things on even longer than he might otherwise, because he's under threat if he moves out of his office, out of the office that he has, out of the prime minister office, to that he is under threat legally. I mean, maybe we don't want to get into that because it's, maybe a minor thing compared with let's take over Gaza completely. But I was just wondering.
it's conjecture in a sense. I mean, either way, he's got to face the music eventually himself, and he's, what I understand, so unpopular. But how many people are dying in the process, though? That's like you say, it may well be causing him to stick with the irredentist types that say, "Oh, let's just delay, let's continue the war. We'll get what we want eventually." Who knows? But the fact remains, like, they were so quick to cut off funding to UNRWA, which, yeah, was pretty sarcastic about the item I just sent out 1 or 2 blasts ago about a bit less genocide, please. It was like no one else is doing the work. I mean, of course, you're employing 13,000 people, and you've got to employ the local people, and many of the local people may have split loyalties as far as what their overall look would be. But the fact remains, you've got to assume you're going to have a few characters that will be bad actors, and for them to just say, "Oh yeah, I guess we better cut off funding." I mean, it just struck me as, we can't even get them to cut off funding to Israel and talk about Ukraine and whatever is another whole topic. But the fact remains, how fast they said, "Oh yeah, we're going to stop the checks to UNRWA," which I just, we're left dumbstruck. Like, you cut them off. They're about sacks of flour and housing and tents, and I mean, they may have some people working for them that you would not like, perhaps horrible people. But if they drive a truck properly and deliver the food, I mean, that's what they're being paid to do by UNRWA. So it just struck me as the most bizarre thing. And it happened lickety split. And here we are debating the ins and outs of international law. And so I don't know. But
they did.
Anyone else want to close? Go ahead, John.
They have said recently, I noticed that theoretically that was only a temporary halt. Well, let's get on with getting it over with.
Exactly. How temporary does it take you to starve to death? I don't know.
Right.
Does anyone else want to close it out for us, or we'll and let's see, I guess
Alan, it was a great talk. Thank you
you
very
did a
much.
very nice job, Alan. Thank you
Well,
so much.
thank you all for having me.
Thank you.
Yeah, and everyone's patience
Thank
and
you.
everyone behaved so beautifully. It was like, yeah. Okay, just and if you're not a member of Peace Action, please join up, because you can help us in our lobby work and all sorts of things. Ron, oh, you're applauding. Okay. And with that, I guess we can sign off. But again, please make sure we have your email address so we can keep you up to date. And I think 2 months from now, we're looking at someone who's looking at the climate effects of militarism, which we had some time ago, but this woman, my understanding, does a very nice job. I've seen a little bit of her work.
Who's
And
this? Was that Mike?
Oh, the name.
Is that Lisa Savage or
I
somebody
think
else?
that's who he's talking about. I mean,
Okay.
it's 2 months down the line, so.